When I think back on my childhood, there are two distinct and separate parts. The first part, the one I consider to be good, was when my mother was alive. My sister and I were raised and loved by our mother, Athena. My mother was petite with dark features and black hair. I inherited her Spanish heritage look. As a child, I was smaller than other kids my age. We lived in a rural, white-bread area, so I was different. And, as is usually the case, I was bullied by some kids. Early on, because of my mother's nurturing nature, I lacked the necessary skills for self-defense. The aggression of other kids at school took me by surprise, and I didn't have the resources available to protect myself. My father was very different than my mother. While my mother was petite, dark-skinned, always smiling, and had an easygoing demeanor, my father was quite the opposite. Red-faced, bony, angular, and ill-tempered, Sebastian, my father, owned a successful moving and transportation business in part. He worked long hours and, based on our living arrangements, wasn't able to make a lot of money. But, somehow, the business stayed afloat. And that was a good thing. My dad was very irritable. He couldn't keep a job as an employee. His one and only weakness was Athena, my mother. Under her protective wing, Riley, my sister, and I escaped the brunt of his temper. He mostly left us alone. Whenever Sebastian, my father, would start to direct his abuse toward me, my mom would reassure me that everything was okay. "Marcus, don't worry, I've got you." And she did, for a while. Sadly and suddenly, my mother passed away 3 weeks after my 10th birthday. The doctors told us that she had an undiagnosed heart condition. Thankfully, it was rapid and painless. For my sister and I, the pain of her death would linger for a very long time. I think this is the worst part of my childhood. Not only did my mom cook, clean, and care for the house, but her emotional support for us was far more important. Household chores were now the responsibility of Riley and me. There was no family discussion about how we would all have to pitch in. My father expected us to cook, clean, and take care of everything around the house. When my mom was alive, her naturally kind demeanor had a calming effect on my father's volatile temper. Without her, his irritability blossomed, both physically and verbally. And without a doubt, I was the primary target for these attacks. The only positive takeaway from all of this was I learned how to defend myself. I also developed reflexes to avoid whip-like blows from Sebastian's open or closed fists. After the 8th grade, we were all moved to the local public high school. I was still small for my age and dark-skinned. Once again, I became the target of bullying by the upperclassmen. Usually I would ignore the name-calling and occasional shoves. But this time, it was different. There was a family who lived on the good side of town, the Morgans. There was a girl, Sable Morgan, in my grade. She had a couple of older brothers and they had a posse. Their family was wealthier than most, certainly wealthier than us. One day, Riley and I were walking to the bus stop when the older Morgan kid, Vincent, decided to pick on me. There were a bunch of them in Vincent Morgan's car. Vincent pulled into the bus lane, and then they all got out. Vincent, Cody Morgan, Sable, and a couple of other kids. Vincent started teasing us about our financial situation and the cheap clothes we were wearing. Riley whispered to me, "Just ignore them, they'll leave." I followed my sister's suggestion and we continued walking. The name-calling got louder and the shoves were a bit more forceful. I was used to this kind of abuse from my father, and I had become numb to the minor physical attacks. But then the Morgans' attention turned to Riley. I've described myself as small, I could be called skinny. I inherited my mother's small stature and her dark hair and complexion. Riley is tall and thin like my dad, but over the past year her chest had developed. This became Vincent's focus. "Your sister's got nice tits," Morgan sneered. "Let us see them and then we'll leave you alone." "Just keep walking," Riley said softly to me. And we took a couple of more steps. Suddenly Morgan grabbed Riley's breast and tore at her shirt. Riley screamed and pulled away. The rest of the Morgan posse hooted with delight. I reacted quickly. As Riley separated from Vincent, I spun around and slapped him in the face, just like my father had done to me so many times. Morgan dropped Riley and turned aggressively toward me. There was a look of both surprise and anger on his face. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, kid," Morgan snarled at me. He lunged at me. Morgan was 6 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier than me. But I was protecting my sister. We locked up and his posse formed a crude circle around us. They were excited to watch their friend beat up the smaller kid. Morgan threw a long hook to my left cheek. It was a good punch, and would have knocked down an average kid, but I was used to this kind of treatment and more, much more from Sebastian. My reflexes were fast, and I had learned to roll with Sebastian's punches. When Morgan hit me, most of the force from the punch was not absorbed. Morgan then paused, expecting that he had knocked me down. It hadn't happened, and as he paused, I quickly slipped in close and hit him twice, left and right. I split his lip with the first punch and connected with his eye socket with the second. This enraged the bully. Ultimately, his size and strength prevailed over my defense, but I had landed a couple of good punches, catching him off guard. I ended up on the ground with my hands up over my head and my legs drawn close to my stomach to protect my testicles. A teacher came running over and the fight was over. Both Riley and I refused any official attention, claiming that we didn't know the identity of our attackers. I was definitely bruised up, but compared to a peak Sebastian beat down, I would rank this one as moderate. I noticed Vincent had a pretty bad shiner at school the next day. From that point forward, the Morgans left us alone. Riley even became friendly with me at school, and once, Vincent and I passed each other in the hallway, and he nodded at me in a half-hearted way. From that point forward, people's perception of me at school seemed to change. People left me alone, and I managed to put together a small group of friends. Certainly nothing close to the popular kids. The Morgan kids were in that group. No, I was just average, mediocre, almost invisible to the upper echelon at our school. But the reality of my life was anything but blissful. We were poor. My father, from this point forward, I will refer to him as Sebastian. I don't think of him in any familial way, was abusive and exceptionally unpleasant. School was okay, but I wanted to escape the entire environment. College was out of the question financially. I was contemplating my future in the middle of my junior year when I suddenly found an escape. Military recruiters had set up a table in the library. They were handing out information on opportunities in the United States Army. At this point in my life, I had no direction, no specific future, and certainly no path leading to any accomplishments. The opportunity in the military seemed like it could change that. If I was accepted, there would be benefits for 6 years of enlistment. There was also training for a career. It all sounded good, a perfect solution to my situation. Most importantly, it was a way to get away from my miserable life in East Texas. The only thing I would miss was my sister Riley. The good news was she had a good boyfriend and she was graduating this spring. His family owned a car dealership in town and Riley said that he would eventually take over the business. If there was anything that came close to feeling positive about high school, it was my senior year. I joined the wrestling team and wrestled at the 141-pound weight class. I was quick, had good reflexes, and I never gave up. The only thing that I was lacking was experience. Most of these guys had wrestled for years, even so I won more matches than I lost. I also drifted into the popular crowd occasionally, and went to some of the big senior parties often with my wrestling teammates. Surprisingly, one of the people who was nice to me was Sable Morgan. She was definitely part of the popular group at school and hung out with a group of other pretty senior girls. Sable had blonde hair, a great figure, and she was beautiful. She'd had enough boyfriends that I had casually observed. At one of the high school parties, she told me that she was going to college in Austin in North. Marcus, she asked me, "What are you doing next year?" I told her that I was planning on joining the military. The military? She seemed surprised. "You don't want to go to college. There's great parties there," she told me. I mumbled something, and she drifted back to her more interesting and popular friends. I felt like somehow my life decisions were not up to her standards. I wanted to say I didn't care, but my life was filled with disappointments. This was just another small one. I had met with the Army recruiters and was scheduled to leave on July 18th for Fort Jackson, South Carolina to attend 10 weeks of basic combat training. More than anything, I was looking forward to getting away from my home state of Texas. There was one last party I went to, kind of like a graduation ceremony. It was at the house of some young kids in a nice neighborhood close to where the Morgan family lived. I arrived late, I had to help Sebastian, and the party was in full swing. I'm not much of a drinker, but the other attendees more than made up for my lack of consumption. Late in the evening, Sable, who I had noticed was circling the party, fell into me. Apparently she had had too much to drink. Her speech was slurred and her movements were affected. "Are you having fun, Marcus?" she whispered into my ear. I looked at her, and even when drunk, she was still very attractive. She had on a form-fitting dress tonight, and was obviously not wearing a bra. I couldn't help myself, I knew it was rude, but I stared at her chest. "Are you looking at my tits?" she giggled and asked me. I quickly looked up and saw her eyes. "It's okay," she said. "I don't care if you look." Just then, a friend called to her. She adjusted her dress, smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and wobbled off to her friends. I was haunted by a vivid image burned into my mind, an erection. There was no going away party or any sort of celebration in the days leading up to my departure for Fort Jackson. I had a quiet dinner the night before with Riley and Amir, her boyfriend, at a diner in town. Riley hugged me tightly and told me to be safe. The next morning, Sebastian didn't even say goodbye. I was so numb to his lack of affection that I didn't really care. Basic training was, without question, very tough and demanding. It was both physically and mentally stressful. Some of the guys that I went through becked with quit. Long marches with 35-pound backpacks. Hot, humid, and oppressive conditions. It's completely understandable why people would quit. For me, compared to what I had endured being raised by Sebastian, the transition wasn't that difficult. Plus, the military encouraged a sense of brotherhood within a family, something that I never had before. Our drill sergeant emphasized the importance of emotional, mental, and moral discipline in addition to physical conditioning. I passed the challenges of basic. I was always one of the first to volunteer to do something. When we were taught combat skills, including hand-to-hand combat, I always jumped in and fought the bigger guys. And I made friends. During basic training, you work together in a team environment. They drilled into our heads that we all needed to look out for each other. We could be deployed to a real war zone soon. We needed to be prepared. One of the best compliments I received was from my drill sergeant. "Private Zapp, we might actually be able to make a soldier out of you." He wasn't big on compliments. This was the closest I'd ever come to being praised. After completing basic, you go on to advanced individual training. 8. I was sent to infantry school. At infantry school, you become a weapons expert. Small arms, anti-armor weapons, and indirect fire weapons. You learn about weapons maintenance and operating vehicles. I could feel the change in me both physically and mentally. I had gone into basic barely over 150 pounds. I had gained muscle. I was always skinny and lanky on the verge of being gaunt. But now there was some muscle there too. I was now 170 pounds. I also became isolated throughout my training. Without a doubt, both basic and 8 were tough, but for some reason I enjoyed it. I liked the physical and mental challenge of all the different training courses. My instructors put me through all the tough drills. They would pair me up with the biggest and most aggressive fellow trainees. Most of the time I would win the challenges. The positive feedback and how I performed in the training challenges gave me confidence. I carried myself differently. I was definitely a far cry from the shy kid who had walked into high school in East Texas. Once again, I was loving it. There was a lot to learn, but I was quickly understanding how well the military suited me. I was deployed to the Middle East after 8. Conditions in Iraq were arguably the toughest. We were often in tents in some dusty location. Temperatures would routinely reach triple digits. There were months without a real shower, and more often than not, clean clothes. But the toughest thing for most of us was the fear of being attacked. A suicide bomber, a sniper at a distance, or some kind of explosive booby trap. Our job was to bring peace and stability. You never knew if the locals were on your side or not. The most important thing for the success of our mission was intel. The best way to get intel was to see it firsthand. To do that, we needed to go into hostile territory and report back. Because I was small and dark-skinned, I could blend in with the locals. I picked up some Arabic from one of the locals I confirmed with. I would dress in a ragged Iraqi style. I would walk the streets, speak little, but my eyes were always vigilant, watching as much as I could. There were close calls, and I was always relieved to make it back to the relative safety of the FOB. On a covert recon mission, I was close to turning back when I encountered 3 men coming toward me down a narrow alleyway. As I got closer, I hunched down trying to look as little threatening as possible and sneaked by. The tallest one grabbed the back of my shirt and started talking to me in some version of Arabic that I didn't know. When I didn't respond, he pulled out a 6-inch knife and pointed it at me, demanding something in a language I was unfamiliar with. I quickly assessed. I was in trouble, and it could get a lot worse. Eyes fixed on the knife, I stepped back quickly and swept my leg out as I grabbed his knife-wielding forearm. As I threw him to the ground, I heard his wrist snap, he screamed, and I heard the knife clinking on the cobblestones. His head bounced off the ground and he passed out. I quickly grabbed the knife and turned to the other two. The smallest one had also pulled out a knife and lunged at me as I was picking up the other knife. I jumped back, but he cut me. I punched him with a bare-handed karate chop to the throat. He crumpled to the ground, his windpipe crushed. The third one started to run and I quickly tripped him. I had no other choice. With the knife I had picked up off the ground, I slit his throat. As I hurried away, I thought about killing another person. It was my first time. What I didn't know at the time was, it definitely wasn't the last. Eventually, our company was given leave and most of us opted to go home. My fellow soldiers were excited to go back home to see their friends and family. I was happy to be going, but I didn't have a lot to go home to. Riley and Amir were now engaged. I let her know I was coming home. "Marcus, you have to stay with us," she told me. "I'm not asking you to stay with Dad. He's gotten worse since you've been gone. We rarely go there, and when we do, we never stay long." If there was anything that could compare to the unpleasantness of deploying to Iraq, it was having to put up with Sebastian. Riley told me that there was a small apartment above the garage at the house they lived on Amir's parents' property. The apartment was vacant and I could stay there for my leave. For the first few days I recovered from the combat experience, and then the jet lag from traveling stateside. Some of the guys showed signs of PTSD. So far, I had my stress under control. On the third day, Riley urged me to get out and do something. She said there was a party this weekend outside of Tyler. "Marcus, you have to go. There will be people you know there," Riley pleaded after my attempts to get out of it. The idea of a party was just too far removed from what I was used to. I had been trained in a harsh environment and then had to endure real-life or death situations on a daily basis. This was just too far removed from the college frat party tequila drinking environment of the people I would be meeting at this party. I didn't realize it at the time, but my demeanor had definitely changed since basic. I now had a natural confidence I didn't have before. I was always pretty serious, but my experiences had made me even more serious. Nevertheless, I would go to the party. I told myself that I had to relax. I stayed with Riley and Amir at first, but as time went on, we drifted apart. I probably didn't know half of the people there. I did talk to a few folks that I went to high school with. When they found out I hadn't gone to college but had joined the army, I got two very different reactions. Some people wanted to know all the details about my more violent experiences. Then there were those who didn't care at all about the military and quickly pulled away. I wasn't sure which reaction I liked more. I spoke to a few girls I knew from school. Things were different now. I used to feel intimidated by pretty girls because of my cheap clothes and chaotic family life, but something in the army training had given me a confidence I'd never had before. There was a group of girls from a nearby high school near Tyler. I introduced myself and met a black-haired girl named Sophie Edwards. She was attending a local community college, and I got a clear sense that she was middle-class financially, much more so than others. We had a nice conversation. She seemed more serious than many of the other girls at the party, and a little naive. I liked her. Unfortunately, her friends grabbed her and moved to another area of the party before our conversation could go any further. As she left, she looked back, gave me a small wave, and said goodbye. That made me smile. Around the middle of the party, there was a commotion at the doorway, loud voices and laughter. A new group had arrived, and it seemed they'd already been celebrating beforehand. Suddenly, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Sable Morgan. I saw her brother Cody chasing after some girl. Sable must have been with the group, making all that noise when they arrived. Not long after I noticed her, Sable saw me too. "Marcus Zapp," she yelled, running straight over to where I was standing. "Hey, Shasta," I started. But I didn't get a chance to finish my greeting. Sable, with her full figure and all, wrapped me up in the biggest hug I'd received from a woman in a very long time. After the hug, she planted a wet, enthusiastic kiss on me. "Marcus," she began, "it's been ages since I last saw you. Where have you been?" I told her I'd been in the army and had served overseas. "That's right," she said. "I remember you saying you were joining the army." I was surprised she remembered, given how long it had been since we'd last talked, and that she'd clearly had a few drinks. "You look different," she said, looking me up and down. I didn't think much about it at the time, but my upright posture, 20 pounds of added muscle, and the confidence I'd gained from my training had changed me. And Sable noticed. We talked about various things, mostly about Sable. I found out she'd dropped out of college and was now attending a local community college. We drifted to a dark corner of the backyard. Sable was drinking a mixed drink, and it seemed to be affecting her. She was leaning on me, her soft, full chest pressed against my arm. While we were standing like that, I saw Sophie Edwards and her friends leaving the party. She looked at me with a puzzled but curious expression when she saw Sable draped over me, as if she'd misjudged me. I felt a little bad, but there were other things going on. You have to understand my situation. I'd been through basic training and then ate. I'd spent months in the desert with very few women around. I was a 19-year-old guy in my prime. And I had a gorgeous, sexy girl, someone I'd always thought was out of my league, pressing her body against me. My arousal was almost pushing through my jeans. As the party wound down, Riley and Amir came looking for me, ready to head home. "I'll take him home," Sable said. Riley looked at me, clearly wanting me to leave with them. I was a bit conflicted. I knew Riley wanted me to go with them, but then I saw Sable draping herself all over me. Finally, Amir settled it. He grabbed Riley, smiled at me, and told me to have fun. As the party ended, Sable arranged for a friend to drive us to her apartment. I didn't have a car, and she'd had too much to drink to drive. Her apartment was nice. It was a one-bedroom with a modern kitchen and a balcony overlooking the hills to the south. "I want a drink," Sable called out to me from the kitchen. I didn't really want one, but I politely accepted. "Oh shoot," I heard her exclaim from the kitchen. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Oh, I spilled," she giggled. I saw red wine across the counter and down the front of her shirt. "I'll be right back," she smiled, heading down the hallway. "Laundry tomorrow," she called back to me from the bedroom. Okay, I thought, that was a strange thing to share with myself. I looked down the hallway and then understood. I don't have any clean clothes to wear, so she paused when she saw me. She stood there, smiling at me, completely naked, her full figure on display, freshly shaved. She made no attempt to cover up. She was stunning. I dreamed about Sable countless times throughout high school, and now she was here, real and ready. She wrapped her arms around me and kissed me. Her naked body pressed firmly against me. Then she started undressing me. I began to help with the process. "No," she said, "let me." She took off my shirt, caressing my chest and abs, her fingers running down the front of my jeans. Then she unbuttoned my jeans, took off my shoes, and slid my jeans and boxers off entirely. Now that we were both naked, she took my hand and led me to the bedroom. I caressed her chest, her hips, and finally between her legs. She stroked my arousal, and I had to stop her, nearly reaching my peak. I didn't have much sexual experience. I'd never had a steady girlfriend to practice and experiment with. My brief history was a few short-lived one-night stands. But with Sable it didn't seem to matter. She seemed to enjoy everything I did. Finally, she took a condom from the nightstand, tore it open, and slipped it on me, then guided me. At first I was on top, and she felt amazing. I knew I wouldn't last long. We switched, and she rode me until we both were exhausted. After 2 condoms, we finally drifted off to sleep. During the last days of my leave, I spent nearly all my time with Sable. The sex was great and kept getting better. As my time at home dwindled, I started to realize my connection with Sable wasn't just physical. I began to care about her, and her feelings for me seemed intense, too. "How long will you be gone, babe?" she asked. Her sweet words pleased me. "I don't know," I answered. On the last night of my leave, she nearly wore me out with her passion. We lay there in her bed, unusually quiet. In the dim light, I looked at her. There was a hint of moisture on her cheek. Hey, I started. "What's wrong?" I gently asked, wiping her tears. She turned away, burying her face in the pillow, her shoulders trembling as she cried quietly. I wrapped my arms around her and turned her toward me. "I just don't want you to go," she said. Oh, I thought. I couldn't deny I felt something for Sable too. But she seemed to be at a different level in, well, I guess you could call it our relationship. "Don't worry," I said. "I'll be back and email you. It'll be okay." This wasn't the conversation I expected, but a part of me enjoyed having an emotional connection like this. The next morning, before I left, things took a more serious turn. "But you have to promise me a few things," she began. "First, you need to be careful and make sure you don't get hurt." I smiled and nodded. "Second, you need to email me every day, or at least as often as you can." I nodded, a bit slower this time. And finally, her gaze grew a bit more intense. "No other girls. I'm all the woman you need. You have to promise you'll be faithful." Wait, I thought. I was getting in deep here. But then I thought, where I was headed, there wouldn't be many girls anyway. I smiled at her. She must have thought we had an agreement because she wrapped her arms around me. "Your ride's in 20 minutes. I think we still have time." She smiled, unbuttoning my jeans and giving me one last goodbye. As soon I was back in the Middle East, hot, dusty, just plain uncomfortable. Oh, and one more thing, about half the people living there wanted to kill you, and you weren't sure which half. Yet, this time I actually felt a bit of joy when I got letters from Sable. I'd never felt this way before. We kept in touch often. Now and then she sent me a sultry photo, which undoubtedly got me through some lonely times. I had plenty of time to think about Sable. Was she my girlfriend? She acted like it. Were we committed? Not exactly, except for her telling me I needed to be faithful. But looking back on that conversation, there wasn't any promise about her being faithful. She wasn't exactly the kind of girl I pictured, but she was beautiful, had a great body, she enjoyed sex, and she liked me. I decided to just go with the flow. I had to admit, communicating with her was better than not getting any emails, especially naked pictures. I was still reconning, and had a few close calls. There was always, without a doubt, the fear of getting caught by the bad guys. From the stories we heard, if you think you are about to be caught, you are better off being killed trying to escape than being taken prisoner. One day I was in the barracks and was called to the CO's office. "Marcus," my CO began, "I'd like you to meet Phoenix Marsh." Marsh was a tall, serious man in a clean desert suit. He extended his hand and we shook hands firmly. "Heard a lot of good things about your boy," Marsh said to me. I looked at my CO in confusion. "Marcus, Mr. Marsh works for the CIA." I was still confused, and both my CO and Marsh realized it. "Marcus," Marsh began, "the CIA is responsible for collecting, analyzing, and disseminating vital intelligence on economic, military, political, scientific, and other developments affecting the security of the nation." He explained, "There are times when we need people in sensitive situations. These situations can be dangerous. We think you would fit the bill for this role." I stared at him blankly, still confused. "Son, we want you to come work for us," Marsh said. We sat and talked for over an hour. I didn't really understand it all, but it sounded like an interesting position. I would need to undergo some advanced training in a number of skills, including weapons, interrogation, self-defense, and explosives. One more thing, it would get me out of the Middle East, at least for now. After we finished, my CO spoke to me. "Marcus, you have another 3 weeks leave. Finish up here, take a week or so at home, and report to Langley, Virginia. You will get orders." "Son," Marsh said, extending his hand for another handshake, "good to have you on board." Those last 3 weeks seemed to drag on forever, but soon I was back in East Texas in Riley's apartment. The problem was, I really wasn't there much. I was mostly at Sable's. The sex was great, of course. It had been months since I'd been around any woman in that dusty, dirty Middle East. Having a fresh, clean, sexy woman around was amazing. And beyond the great sex, we were really developing a relationship. She seemed to really care about me. I felt the same, and I was glad to have her as a girlfriend. But there was just a type of disconnect with her. Kind of like winning a shiny red convertible. Anyone would want it, and I could surely appreciate it. But deep down inside, I was a Jeep kind of guy. I pushed those thoughts aside and enjoyed my time with Sable, both sexually and otherwise. "We are having family dinner on Friday," Sable told me. "I want you to come." I knew her brothers. As I explained, I had gone to school with the whole family. Vincent and Cody Morgan, the brothers I could never say I was friends with. I still remembered the experiences of being bullied by them from long ago. They were both known to be fun guys, but with a little bit of a mean streak. The family had money, and both Cody and Vincent were involved in the family business. I met Sable's father for the first time at that Friday dinner. Her parents were divorced, and her mother lived in Florida, and wasn't as involved in Sable's life as I understood. Denny Morgan was a big man, over 6 feet tall and built solid. A little bit of a gut with a shaved head and a thick mustache. He was one of those loud, attention-grabbing types. He tried a few intimidation tactics on me, including a hard handshake and invading my personal space as we talked. With my army training, it didn't bother me. It became an unspoken challenge. He was going to try and get to me. Compared to what I had been through, Denny Morgan didn't faze me at all. Watching the interaction of the Morgan family quietly, I could easily see why Sable's brothers turned into such jerks. They had the perfect role model, Denny. Later, as we drove back to Sable's place, we talked about the evening. "Did you like my family?" Sable asked. I paused for a minute before answering. "They all seemed very nice," I replied. She just stared at me. 2 days before I was supposed to report to Langley, we went to another party. This one was mostly Sable's college friends. I didn't know many people there. Both of Sable's brothers were there. On the drive over, Sable was a little edgy. She had been dropping hints that she wanted a more defined commitment from me. She would ask things like, "Where is this going and how long will you be in the military?" and other future-oriented stories. I was honest and didn't commit. I told her I didn't know what would happen. This seemed to upset Sable. Once we got there, Sable left me rather quickly and went with a group of her friends. I'm not a big drinker and didn't know many people at the party. I sipped on a light beer and stood quietly at the edge of the party. One thing I did notice was her brother, Cody. He was a predator. He aggressively pursued any girl who gave him a moment of interest. The guy was practically an assault in many situations. I was starting to get a little uneasy. The few times we had gone out, Sable would spend at least a little time with me. Not this night. I noticed her glancing at me, checking if I was watching her. It was a little petty. Later in the evening, I saw a big red-haired guy laughing and standing quite close to Sable. A couple of times I saw him put his arm around her. Then I saw what I thought was a whisper, and then she looked at him, laughed and pushed him away. This was going a bit too far. She and I came to the party together. She was my date. This red-haired guy was getting a little too touchy-feely. I walked over. "How are you doing?" I asked casually, walking up to Sable, paying no attention to the redhead. "Go away, man," the redhead said, grabbing me by the shoulder. I ignored him. "Marcus, this is my friend Kenji," Sable said, nodding to the red-haired guy. I looked at him calmly, gave a quick nod and then looked back at Sable. Like I said, Kenji started, "Take off. I'm talking to this girl." This time he put both hands on my shoulders, trying to push me away. I put my left arm up, dislodging his hands, and pushed him back in a short, hard shove. He must have been a little drunk because he stumbled and almost fell. A couple of people laughed, and this seemed to make Kenji mad. His face turned red and there was no doubt he was angry. He quickly stood up. "All right, man, let's take this outside." He grabbed my arm and I swatted his hand away. "I'm sorry," I said calmly and without any regret. "No way, man, you don't get off that easy," Kenji said and shoved me hard in the middle of my back. I staggered but didn't fall. Kenji was right behind me with some of his friends, Sable and a few other people. Sable was weakly calling out to not fight. I wasn't interested in a fight, but I wouldn't back down from a jerk like Kenji. We all ended up going to the dead-end alleyway. "Listen," I started to say to Kenji, hands on my hips, "there is no reason for a fight." I apologized. "Now let's just..." That's when he hit me. I wasn't in a defensive stance at all. I was trying to get out of this stupid fight. He threw a long hook. If it landed on me, it would have done some damage. Luckily, I moved just enough for the punch to just graze the top of my head. Still, with his size and strength, it was very painful. All right, I thought. There was no way out of an all-out brawl. I put my hands up in a defensive stance, the way I was trained. I studied my opponent, like they taught us in hand-to-hand combat. I saw a big, fairly slow guy who relied on strength. The fact that he was drunk made the task easier. He threw another hard punch. I quickly stepped inside, blocking the punch with my left hand and hit him with a 3-punch combo, right, left, right. My punches caught him by surprise, and he stood there for a second, dazed, trying to figure out what was happening. As he came up, I launched a full-powered roundhouse kick to his left knee. We heard the sound of ligaments tearing mixed with his scream as he went down. The punches had opened cuts on his face. Kenji lay on the ground groaning, clutching his obviously injured knee with blood running down his face. There was no sense of victory or accomplishment for me. I'd seen enough fights where the opponent was an actual enemy, and that enemy wanted you dead. Not some drunk guy. If anything, I felt a little bad for Kenji, though it was all his fault. "Sable," I said louder than usual, "let's go." I blamed Sable partially for the events of the evening. She could have easily put Kenji in his place if she wanted to. I was silent with her on the drive back home. About halfway there, she seemed to realize I was upset with her. "Marcus, I am so sorry about the whole thing with Kenji. He's an old college friend and I hadn't seen him in a long time. We were just catching up." I didn't respond to her thoughtless apology at first. "Listen, Sable," I finally started, "I understand you have friends, both male and female, but the way you acted when you came to the party with me, it didn't seem right. Or at least not right to me." She sat in silence for a moment. I quickly realized she was crying. "What's wrong?" I asked and glanced at her. She sniffed for a moment, not answering. Finally she answered. I'm sorry, Marcus," she began. "It's just you are so nice, you are different from the other guys. I don't want to lose you. And you're right, I shouldn't have been so friendly with Kenji. I guess I wanted to see how serious you were about this relationship." That opened up a whole new discussion about commitment, long-term, and what we expected from each other. On the drive to Langley, a few days later, I tried to analyze our discussion. We both committed to being exclusive. We both were open to seeing what the future might bring. But in my mind, there was no formalization to the relationship beyond calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend. As I mulled over the situation, I realized I liked Sable as a girlfriend. She was beautiful, had a great body, she enjoyed sex, and she was a pretty good person. But, on the other hand, when I pictured what my life would look like in the long term, I couldn't picture marriage and family with Sable. I decided to enjoy the positive parts of this relationship right now, and figure out the rest later. My training at Langley was intense. While basic training and it was tough, this was different. In my army training, it was all about operating as a team, working together with the rest of the platoon to achieve the goal. Intelligence training was different. It was all about working on your own, being in dangerous situations, gathering vital information, making quick and confident decisions, how to react to bad guys. It was stressful, intense, and complicated, and I loved it. I had a number of instructors for all the training they put me through, but I reported directly to Phoenix Marsh. He was the one who listened to me and encouraged me to talk to him openly. Phoenix constantly expressed to me how precarious some of my missions would be. He also went to great lengths to explain the importance of my assignment. I also felt that Phoenix genuinely cared about my well-being beyond the assignment. The days were long. I was physically and mentally drained. There was little time for rest, but I was changing. I had put on an extra layer of muscle. My hand-to-hand combat training was a series of getting my butt kicked by big, mean dudes. And then I started winning. Beyond the physical things, I learned interrogation techniques. I learned basic types of explosives. I took language courses, surveillance, counter-surveillance, and other covert training. Phoenix notified me I needed to be in South America in 2 weeks. Take a week to chill out, and then plan on heading south on the 11th. Your orders will be sent to you before then. I had some time off and went to visit Sable. The reunion was, of course, filled with amazing sex. At the peak of our most intense moments, the word love started to slip out as we were having sex. Initially it was mainly from her, but I found myself telling her that I loved her too. Many of our discussions centered on the future, long-term plans, what was going to happen next in our relationship. I was getting confused. The things I had initially found lacking in Sable were her maturity and dependability. I had to admit she was making strides on the maturity front. As for dependability, there was just the one incident with Kenji that bothered me. She didn't give me any reason to doubt her fidelity. During an intense lovemaking session a few days before I was supposed to leave for Venezuela, we were talking in between breaths, lost in our mutual pleasure. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered to me, "I wish you didn't have to go." "I know," I said, "I don't have a choice." Honestly, I was both excited and nervous to start my first mission. "I want us to be together forever," she pledged. "I know," I said, "me too." There were more intimate whispers, talking about the future and discussing long-term plans. I realized later these were very serious pronouncements and literally interpreted by Sable. For me, they were more like postcoital endearments. The night before my flight out, there was a party at her dad's house, Denny's. Her whole family was there, including her brothers, Cody and Vincent. I still couldn't get along with her brothers or her dad. I just wasn't interested. That night I found myself talking to Vincent. If you ever know someone you know is a jerk and they try to be nice, it's so annoying. You end up wishing they would just be their normal jerk selves. That was Vincent. "So I hear you and Sable are getting serious," he said. I nodded in response, not really agreeing. Vincent looked at me. I assume he expected a more forceful response. His eyes got mean. He put his familiar arm around me with his hand on the back of my neck, applying pressure. "You know," he whispered to me, "since my mom left, Cody and I have looked after Sable. We don't want to see her hurt," he said, staring intently at me. "Understand?" he asked and squeezed my neck harder. For a moment I tensed up and started going into a defensive mode. I could have torn him apart in seconds, but I didn't. I just smiled and nodded. Vincent left without saying anything more. I finished up my mission in South America. There were a few tense moments, but mostly what I did was observe, blend in, gather any intelligence I could. This actually started a pattern where I would be in country, wherever that was at the time, for the amount of time needed to complete the task. Then I would go back to East Texas, spend time with Sable, and then head back to Fort Meade. The reunions with Sable were mostly good, enjoyable, a glimpse of the real world, very different from my missions. But things were changing between Sable and me. She became more demanding. She became possessive. She asked me about what I did while I was gone. I had a cover story about working for the State Department. That's what I told anyone who asked about my job, including Sable. She wanted to start planning, maybe moving in together. Her dad, she said, would help with the house. I knew I really cared for Sable, enjoyed this relationship, and didn't want to lose her. But I was still hesitant to take that leap. And next came marriage. She told me all of her friends were getting married. I stalled and delayed. One of her good friends from college was getting married in a few months. She wanted to make sure I could go. I asked Phoenix. I hated to bother him with these domestic requests. But I did ask about that particular date. Phoenix thought it wouldn't be a problem. As the date of her friend's wedding got closer, it looked like we were going to have a conflict. Things weren't ending as quickly as initially thought. Before calling Sable, I checked with Phoenix. "I hate to ask this," I began, my personal life seeming too small for the job. But I was hoping to be back in the States next Saturday. There was a pause. For a second, I thought maybe the call had dropped. "Listen, son," Phoenix said, "this is pretty important stuff we are doing here. At this point, I don't see it happening. I will do what I can, but I am still doubtful." I hung up feeling bad for asking. I had been briefed on the sacrifices necessary for my position. I understood and agreed to them up front. The difficult part was I couldn't tell anyone about the nature of my work, including Sable. I called her and broke the news. Things didn't go well. She was angry at first and then switched to crying. I kept apologizing but couldn't give any explanation. Finally, she went silent and scornful. I promised to see her as soon as I could. "Fine," she replied coldly. Then she hung up. Communications were spotty when I was in the field. Both infrastructure and security reasons. The fact that we finished the mission earlier than expected helped. I was on a military transport heading to Ellington Joint Reserve Base near Houston. From there it was about 200 miles to Tyler. I could get there before the wedding was over. After landing, it took a while to find a car for me, but they got me one quickly. I took off and called Sable. No answer. I remembered where the reception was, but when I got there, close to midnight, the building was dark. I drove to Sable's apartment. It was dark and locked. Luckily, one of the skills I learned was the ability to pick locks, and cheap residential locks weren't much of a challenge. I checked the apartment and found it empty. For a brief moment, I wondered if anyone else was here with Sable. A fleeting moment of curiosity and an emotion I couldn't immediately define filled me. It was 12:45 a.m. and I decided to wait and surprise her when she got back. I flopped down on the couch and put my feet up on the coffee table. Within minutes, the fatigue from traveling made me fall asleep. I woke with a jolt. I checked the clock, 6:20 a.m., still no Sable. I decided to make coffee. By 7:30, she still hadn't come home. I waited. Just as I was about to call her, I heard the door slam. I looked out the front window and saw Sable, holding her high-heeled shoes, walking up the driveway. I caught a quick glimpse of a black pickup truck driving away. This was going to be interesting. I sat on the couch with my coffee. She opened the front door. "Oh my God," Sable yelled, "you scared the crap out of me. What are you doing here? I didn't think you would make it. Why didn't you call?" I looked at her as she rambled on. Sure, I had surprised her. That was understandable. But I sensed something else. I saw something that looked like guilt on her face. She was acting as if she had been caught in some wrongdoing. Part of my training at Langley focused on how to react if you were caught doing something wrong. The psychology of innocence was demonstrated. There was no doubt, based on what I was seeing, that Sable without training would flunk this workshop. Finally, her questions subsided. I could tell she was trying to read my expression, searching my face to see if she had been discovered. I kept a blank expression. "How did you get here?" she asked. "What happened?" I mentally reviewed the situation as I arrived, studying her expressions and reactions. There was definitely something off. The party ended, and then a bunch of us went back to Tina's place, she recounted. It was late, and I just slept on her couch for a couple of hours. I just nodded silently, my expression blank, staring at her. "What?" she exclaimed. "You are staring at me. Let me clean up and I will make you breakfast." And then she walked to the bedroom. Unlike usual, she closed the door tightly as she entered. There was clearly something wrong. To what extent, I didn't know. But I was going to find out. I dialed my phone as I heard the shower start. Washing off the evidence, I guessed. I had a colleague, Lillian Lopez, who often helped with surveillance. She was stationed at Lackland and owed me a favor. I sent her some information and explained what I wanted. She agreed without question. Sable made breakfast, and we talked, almost normally. The elephant in the room was what had really happened the night before. I was pretty sure I knew. With Lillian's help, I would confirm it. "Unfortunately, I have to head back to Fort Meade tonight," I lied. I was actually pretty good at that. It was a survival skill for me. Sable protested and begged me to stay longer, but I also sensed a little bit of relief on her face. She needed to get her story straight and make sure any witnesses understood. She wanted this all covered up. That night, I called Sable from Langley. I could tell in her voice that she had relaxed. No guilt stress in her voice. She told me how much she loved me and missed me. She even started the usual long-term discussion. The information from Lillian would really determine where things went with Sable. As I said, there were a lot of good things about Sable, starting with her looks. She was also fun and she enjoyed sex. But, in my line of work where I was often gone for extended periods of time, dependability, support, and loyalty were among the most important qualities I needed in a long-term partner. It didn't take me long to realize these weren't Sable's strong suits. The Friday after the wedding, and after my surprise visit to Sable's house, Lillian sent me a text. "Encoded docs sent to your secure email." And that was it. I had been talking to Sable every night, and part of me had started to believe her story about what happened after the wedding. She had been committed to her love and desire. All of that vanished when I opened Lillian's email. She had followed Sable twice to an apartment near school, and one time she had photos of a large, red-haired visitor entering Sable's apartment at 9:22 p.m. and leaving the next morning at 8:18 a.m. Lillian had identified the guy as Kenji Bennett. Yes, the same red-haired Kenji I had punched at that party. I didn't really blame him. Sable was very beautiful and sexy. My opinion of Sable, without a doubt, had completely changed. I texted her and said I would be down to visit in a couple of days. She was thrilled about that and started talking about all the things we would do when I got there. She proclaimed her love for me, but must have sensed my less than reciprocated attitude. "Marcus," she began, "are you okay?" she asked. I told her I would see her in a couple of days and hung up. On the drive down, I was thinking about Sable. There was definitely a part of me that was sad. We had had some great times together. She was actually my first long-term girlfriend. But I needed someone I could trust, and now it was clear. That wasn't Sable. Sable went to great lengths to look good for me. Low-cut top, makeup. She actually looked very good. "Oh, Marcus," she began, "I missed you so much." I didn't reciprocate her hug. She pressed all of her feminine parts against me. I stood woodenly, silent, with my hands stiff at my sides. Not the reaction she was expecting. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, looking at me with a worried face. "Sable, let's sit down. We have some things to talk about." Okay. Whatever you want to talk about, let's talk." "Here," she said, "sit here." And she patted the spot on the sofa next to where she was sitting. I sat in the chair across from her. She, once again, started to ramble about how much she missed me and needed me. Finally, I raised my hand in a stop gesture. Remember, I began the first time we met, and we talked about how, in the line of work, I needed someone I could trust and rely on. Her expression flinched a bit at my words, but she quickly nodded in agreement. And remember, when we talked about being exclusive, that if either of us changed our minds, we would talk about it. She nodded, eyes wide and round. An animal caught in the hunter's snare. You didn't keep your promise, I said to her. I know about Kenji. Kenji? What about Kenji? She asked, her face looking panicked. Sable, I said, anger rising, I know. Then she really started. They were just friends. Nothing happened between them. He was part of her old college group. I was the only one she cared about. You're saying you never had sex with Kenji, right? I asked. She hesitated for just a moment. No, of course not, she said. I reached into my backpack, pulled out a 9x11 envelope, and handed her the set of pictures showing Kenji entering her apartment, date stamped 9:22 p.m., then leaving, looking a bit disheveled, the next morning at 8:18 a.m. Part 1 has ended with many unanswered questions. Part 2 will be the answer to all the mysteries. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to find out.